Alright, today we're going to focus on a different type of factoring, and this is factoring by grouping. If you can do the greatest common factor, today what you're going to find out is that factoring by grouping is simply doing that 3 times maybe in one problem. So you can feel confident to know that today is based upon something that you have been previously taught. So it's not a whole bunch of brand new stuff. I have these steps here. First of all, step number 0 or step number 1 is always the same. Look for greatest common factor. Something to consider. You only want to do this whenever you have 4 terms. This is dealing with 4 terms. So consider factoring by grouping when you have 4 terms. And remember, a term is anything separated by a plus or a minus. Put parentheses around the first 2 terms and the last 2 terms. Okay, this is the process, and I'll show you this. Factor out common factors out of both parentheses, and that should say greatest common factors out of both parentheses. All right, and then factor out each greatest common factor again, or common factor, same thing, because you'll notice that in that step. All right, so notice that it was factor out common factor, and so let's jump straight into it, looking at number 1. As if I'm going to factor this by using the greatest common factor, the idea says that first I need to look for just the greatest common factor out of all of these. And notice that there's not an X in everything, there's not a 2 or a 7 in everything, so I cannot divide out a greatest common factor. If that's the case, since I have 4 terms, the next step would be to put parentheses around the first 2 terms and the last 2 terms. Notice how I did not include the plus sign, because cutting that plus sign off, the 2x is still positive. You know, some things change, and I'll show you those in a second. After you factor those first 2 and the last 2, what you want to do is factor each individual parenthesis using the greatest common factor. So that's what step 3 is saying. So the greatest common factor out of these 2 is an x, and so what I have left over is x plus 7. And the greatest common factor out of those 2, we'll bring my plus sign down, is a 2. And what I have left over is x plus 7. And so I factored out a 2 here and an x here. Notice whatever I factored out, those 2, don't have anything to do with each other. They don't have a relationship. So whatever you factor out here doesn't mean that you're going to have the same thing factored out here. Now notice once you get to this step, you have 2 terms. You have this term here and this term here. Out of those 2 terms, the greatest common factor out of both of those, hopefully you see it, is x plus 7. So you can divide that out of both terms, and whatever's left over is what goes in your second parenthesis. Now if I FOIL that out real quick, x times x is x squared. X times 2 is 2x. 7 times x is 7x. 7 times 2 is 14. Now look at this and look at that. Aren't both of those the same? This is your answer. Okay, I'll show it to you again over here. The first step is to look to see if there's a greatest common factor that I can factor out of all 4, and I cannot. Again, since I do have 4, then I'm thinking of factoring by grouping, which simply says put parentheses around the first 2 and parentheses around the last 2. Notice again that I did not include the plus sign. Is it wrong if you do? No. I just chose not to because cutting that plus sign off, the 4x is still positive. Alright? So, individually, not even looking at this one, I'm going to factor out my greatest common factor here, which is simply an x. And that leaves me with x plus 1 after I factor out everything. And over here, I'm going to factor out the greatest common factor here, and that is a 4. So, after I divide out a 4, I have x plus 1. Notice that on number 1 and number 2, that once I did that, my 2 terms have a common factor inside the parenthesis. Whenever you factor in using the greatest common factor, or whenever you're factoring by grouping, this step right here should happen. You should get the same thing in the parentheses and in each term. X plus 1 is what I take from both of those. I divided out that x plus 1, which is a common factor, and whatever's left over goes in the second parenthesis. Now, before you box or circle your answer, you should always look at your binomials to see, because every now and then there will be some that you can actually factor some more, maybe a difference of squares or something like that. So heed my warning and always look to see if you can factor something some more. So if it show up on a test or a quiz, I won't hear complaints now. Alright, looking at number 3. First thing I look for on number 1 and number 2 was the greatest common factor. And I'm going to do the same thing here. But notice I don't have a greatest common factor. It's very tempting because each one of those are even. And then those two are divisible by 5, but you can't actually do anything there. So there's no greatest common factor. I have 4 terms, so I'm going to look to put parentheses around the first 2. But notice the last 2 here have this one, or the second sign is negative. I'm going to include that. If I cut that off and put the parenthesis right here after the negative, that makes that a positive 30x. So I have to include that because I don't want to change the sign. Doing that up here, putting the parenthesis right in front of that plus sign, that 4x is still positive. Again, if I cut it off right here, that 30x changes signs, and I don't want to do that. So here we go. I'm going to factor out the greatest common factor here, which is not just a number or a variable, it's a combination. I can take out a 2. Oops, can't see that, can you? I can take out a 2 and x squared, right? Doing so would leave me with 6x plus 1. Yeah, I just had a brain fart. I actually literally just had a brain fart. Now, over here, I'm going to factor out the greatest common factor, which is 5. But whenever your third term or your leading coefficient in this second parenthesis, whenever that is negative, you have to make sure that whatever you factor out is a negative. You never want to leave the number that's first inside your parenthesis as a negative number. So since this 30x is negative, I know the common factor here is 5. I am going to factor out a negative 5. So I can make this first one become positive. And when you do that, when you divide both of those by negative 5, you get 6x plus 1. These are where people mess up because they're not careful with their signs. Remember, I said that this step right here, whenever you factor by grouping, should give you the same thing. And if you did something wrong, you just don't magically go and change some signs. You got to go figure out what it is that you did wrong because you're going to mess something up. All right, 6x plus 1 is what comes out. And I have 2x squared minus 5. That's not a difference of squares. So that's how that factors. All right, finally on number 4, I have 4 terms. And in each one of these terms, I notice that all my numbers, all my coefficients are multiples of 5. They're all divisible by 5. So what does that mean? That means right off the top, I could actually factor out a greatest common factor of 5. So if I divide out of 5, that's 21n cubed plus, what was that, 35n squared. Minus 15 n minus, 25. Okay, so all I did is just gave me smaller numbers to deal with. On all of these problems, none of them had a greatest common factor at the very beginning except number 4. So look for it. It doesn't happen all the time, but it will happen. So always look for a greatest common factor. Now, I have 4 terms. It's possible that this could factor some more. And so what I'm going to do is I use brackets because you'll mess up if you use double parentheses. I'm going to try to factor the first 2 and the last 2 here. Okay? So as I look at 21n cubed and 35n squared, I notice that I can take out a 7n squared from both of those. That's going to leave me with 3n plus 5 whenever I factor out a 7n squared. Over here, again, this one is negative. The third term, or the first one in the second binomial, is negative. So whatever I factor out here should be negative. And so negative 15n and negative 25, the greatest common factor here is a 5, but I'm going to pull out a negative 5. And so that gives me 3n plus 5. Now, I didn't make that up. I didn't look over here and say this one got to be the same. I let this tell me what I had. And now I notice that I have a common factor. But you can't forget the 5. You can still use the brackets if you like, but I'll go ahead and say parentheses 3n plus 5, 7n squared minus 5. And there you go. Okay, one thing I want to tell you real quick is that sometimes whenever you put parentheses around your second term or your second, their last two terms, sometimes there's nothing to factor. For example, if I had blah, 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 and then the last two terms were r plus 6, and I put parentheses around the first two and parentheses around the last two, you have to factor out something, even if there is no greatest common factor. And if there is no greatest common factor, we always put the number that is a greatest common factor for everything, and that is a 1. So the way you would factor this is you would say 1 times r plus 6. So just in case you ever have something inside parentheses that you group that doesn't factor, you can factor out a 1. Or if that was a negative r, you can factor out a negative 1. So be careful of that. Make sure you're careful of your signs. Notice the second numbers were always, the signs change as well. If you got questions, let me know, and I will see you later.